To truly understand the reason for Vladimir Putin's invasion of the Ukraine, you need to understand the man first. I call it Putin's invasion because I don't for a second believe that anyone else in Russia would have voluntarily chosen to attack a sovereign neighbor. Since he first stepped onto the political stage as President of Russia in 2000, Vladimir Putin has had an unnerving ability to radiate menace, without raising his voice or changing his facial features much. Yet despite this, and the violence of his Russian government, as demonstrated in Chechnya and Georgia, Western opinion formers were still inclined to treat him as a pantomime villain. Someone to view cautiously but not too seriously. But they should have. He was a bully with absolute power, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Just before the invasion of the Ukraine, the world was shown his darker side, when on live television he toyed with Sergei Naryshkin, the head of his foreign intelligence service, making the feared security man look like a stuttering fool. But the striking part was the pleasure he took in humiliating somebody in front of an audience. What we didn't know at the time was that Putin was about to plunge Europe into its biggest land war since 1945. Russian troops launched a full-scale invasion on the 24th of February. Within the month, more than 10 million Ukrainians had fled their homes, thousands of troops and civilians had been killed, and the coastal city of Mariupol had been destroyed. Even though Western intelligence services had warned for months that Russia was poised to attack, many in the West, both and Russia refused to believe it. After more than 20 years of his leadership, they had grown overconfident in how they perceived him. Yes, he was ruthless and violent, but he was also believed to be rational and committed to Russia's integration into the world economy. No one thought that this upstart bully would take such a high-risk chance with the world's stability. So why did he? In hindsight, the outside world has consistently underestimated or misunderstood him. From the moment he took power, outsiders too often saw what they wanted and played down the darkest sides of bad old Vlad. Everything that Putin has done has been towards strengthening his own power, and he has played it all straight out of the dictator's handbook, something that Adolf Hitler wrote. In his first year in office, he moved immediately to rein in independent sources of power, to assert the central authority of the state, and to use warfare, where necessary, to bolster his power base. The escalation of the war in Chechnya made him seem like a nationalist hero, standing up for Russian interests and protecting the ordinary citizen from terrorism. This also helped install a bordering state with a pro-Putin ally, who shared a similar view on democracy. What's more, when it comes to the current leader of Chechnya, Putin had an ally who was prepared to go to war for him, and Ramzan Kadyrov did just that, sending his now famous Tic-Tac brigade of well-armed and trained fighters to do Putin's bidding in the Ukraine. Then, in an early move that alarmed liberals, the new president reinstated the old Soviet national anthem. His promises to protect media freedom turned out to be empty, and Russia's few independent television networks were brought under government control. So why did he invade the Ukraine? As a narcissistic dictator, Putin hates even an idea of democracy. He successfully rolled back weak democratic institutions in Russia and made them a facade. Thus, the courts, elections and parliament exist, but they are totally subdued to the federal government and, more importantly, him. The only thing left that could ruin his absolute power was an effective and working democracy on the border of Russia. From 2003 to 2005, pro-democracy color revolutions broke out in many of the states of the former Soviet Union, including Ukraine, Georgia and Kyrgyzstan. If demonstrators in Independence Square in Kiev could bring down an autocratic government in the Ukraine, what was to stop the same happening in Red Square and ending the Putin dictatorship? In Russia, where there was still significant suspicion, many believed that it was impossible that these were spontaneous uprisings. As a former intelligence operative whose entire professional career had involved running spycraft, Putin was particularly inclined to see the CIA and other organizations, like the EU, as pulling the strings. The goal, as he saw it, was to install pro-Western puppet regimes, and Russia itself could be next. In a speech in 2005, Putin labeled the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. As a fan of the Soviet era, Putin had the need to see it re-established, and hopefully this would help in protecting his future by ending the spread of democracy in the region. As discussed, he had already converted Chechnya into a vassal state, where the leader of that country openly referred to Putin as his leader. He then attacked Georgia to dilute the Western influence he saw building and as a de facto warning to other countries who were moving away from Russia and his pocket. In a situation that would become oddly familiar, the official reason for the invasion was the recognition of two regions of Georgia that wished to become Russian, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Worldwide recognition of these two regions would never happen, but Putin wasn't really interested in that. He was simply being a bully who needed an excuse to scare his neighbors into towing the line, at least unofficially. At this point the West should have stepped up and acted, but the general apathy simply gave way to more appeasement. The historical similarities to Hitler were starting to build. With Kazakhstan firmly in the grip of its own dictator, Nursultan Abishali Nazarbayev, and Belarus firmly controlled by the Mussolini-like Lukashenko, Putin moved on to those most likely to cause problems. The prospect of the Ukraine signing an association agreement with the European Union was seen as a serious threat by Putin, since it would pull Russia's most important neighbor, once an integral part of the USSR, into the West's sphere of influence. Under pressure from Moscow, the Ukrainian government of President Viktor Yanukovych reversed course. But this provoked another popular uprising in Kiev, forcing Yanukovych to flee. The loss of this political ally was a major geopolitical reverse for Putin. In a reaction to this uprising, Putin marched into the Crimea and annexed the peninsula. He also created and started supporting the breakaway regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, in a carbon copy of his moves in Georgia. They too claimed fealty to Mother Russia. It was an aggressive action and designed to intimidate and push the Ukrainians away from the West. Once again, the West objected, some sanctions were thrown around, but it was all noise as they tried to stop Putin with words. As an example, Germany made no move to stop importing Russian gas, and although Merkel threatened to introduce crippling trade sanctions, German industry convinced her to hold back, based on the fallacy that authoritarian countries can be transformed through trade, which they would soon discover was misplaced, especially when confronting a maniacal psychopath like Putin. Feeling emboldened by the lack of action from the West, Putin no doubt started to feel untouchable. This, coupled with the rise of President Zelensky and his continued push towards the West, showed Putin that his actions in 2014 had failed to quell his neighbor. So, feeling like a jilted lover and intent on flexing his power, he invaded in February 2022. It hasn't worked out as planned, as we all know, but like all good dictators, he will scream profanities, declare that the world is out to get them, and continue regardless. In conclusion, Dark Histories believes this invasion is all about self-preservation and strengthening his future, and has nothing to do with the Russian-speaking people of the Ukraine or any hidden Nazi sects. He is a dictator who sees the writing on the future wall, so he is preparing for it at the cost of his own people and those of Ukraine. There is a special place in hell for people like these.